Aphrodite's, the bridge works. Script from Band 2. Here's a question that should enrage you. Why were you taught that Africa had no writing? Not limited writing, not late writing, no writing. There, right there, you thought, well, Africa's is an oral tradition. Everybody knows that. Did they, though? If you have been listening to or reading any of the essays and articles from Aristides, you will already intuit the answer, but you will likely not guess at the depth of the distortion. You were taught that Africans relied on oral tradition because they supposedly lacked the sophistication to inscribe. That writing emerged elsewhere, Mesopotamia, Greece, China, later Europe, while Africa remained pre-literate, primitive, dependent on spoken memory. That narrative is not ignorance, it is policy. Africa didn't lack writing. Empire required. It remained invisible. Africa developed multiple independent, sophisticated systems of inscription, many predating Latin, some predating Greek, several operating outside alphabetic logic entirely. Kemetic hieroglyphs governed one of history's longest-lasting civilizations, over 3,000 years of continuous written tradition. Meroitic script in Kush remains partially undeciphered not because it's undecipherable, but because academic resources haven't been allocated to translation. Ge'ez in Ethiopia has been in continuous use for over 1,500 years, longer than most European scripts have survived. Nsibidi in Nigeria was an ideographic system encoding law, diplomacy, ethics, romance, designed to be illegible to outsiders as information security. Tifinagh, among Berber and Tuareg societies, was tattooed onto skin, engraved into jewelry, woven into textiles, portable, embodied, resilient, engineered for life in motion. These weren't primitive attempts at European literacy. They were complete epistemologies encoded into visual form. Why this lie has been pivotal in the perception and identity of African-descended peoples worldwide. Colonial scholarship required African illiteracy to justify conquest. If Africans had writing, real writing, systematized writing, ancient writing, the entire moral architecture of empire collapsed. So the scripts had to remain invisible. And so they were. Dismissed when undeniable. Destroyed when accessible. Excluded from curricula when neither worked. Timbuktu's manuscripts were looted and scattered. Nsibidi was classified as pictographic, code for not real writing. Meroitic script was deliberately left untranslated. Ge'ez was reclassified as a Semitic import, despite being indigenous African innovation. This was not accident. This was design. Africa had universities. Africa had archives. Africa had institutions. Sankore University in Timbuktu housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on law, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, ethics, governance. Students traveled from across West Africa and the Maghreb to study there. Scholars wrote commentaries, engaged in intellectual debates through written correspondence, maintained bibliographic catalogues. This was not informal knowledge transmission. This was institutional scholarship. The manuscripts remain, many still unread by modern scholars. They prove African intellectual production operated at civilizational scale. Libraries, universities, manuscript production, scholarly debate, archival preservation. Ethiopian monasteries functioned as scriptoria and archives, maintaining theological, legal, medical, historical texts across centuries. Ethiopian libraries still hold thousands of Ge'ez manuscripts, some catalogued, many not. many still actively used. Kemet's temple schools trained scribes through years-long programs requiring mastery of hundreds of glyphs, grammatical structures, mathematical calculation, legal precedent. This was civil service literacy, writing as state infrastructure, not ornament. The Library of Alexandria didn't invent African knowledge, it collected it. Much of what later Europe attributed to Greek philosophy entered the Western canon through Alexandrian mediation of African and Afro-Asiatic knowledge systems. When Alexandria burned, it wasn't just books that were lost, it was African-centered epistemic continuity. The archive proving Africa as knowledge producer went up in flames. Writing beyond the alphabet. Multiple modalities of memory. Here's what they don't tell you. Africa encoded writing through scarification, bead arrangements, textile patterning, architectural alignment, musical notation, ritual choreography. Meaning was written into bodies, buildings, sound, space. Akan Adinkra symbols, stamped onto cloth, carved into wood, cast into gold weights, encoded proverbs, legal principles, cosmological concepts. Each symbol was a compressed text. Kente cloth patterns carried genealogical information, social status markers, political affiliation. Scarification, permanent marks cut into skin, functioned as identification, initiation record, ethnic affiliation. Among the Nuba, Dinka, Central African societies, specific scar patterns indicated clan membership, age grade completion, spiritual protection. The body became the text. Architecture inscribed meaning into space. Great Zimbabwe's layout encoded astronomical alignment and social hierarchy into stone. Dogon villages were built as cosmograms. The village itself was a three-dimensional text. Talking drums among Yoruba and Akan encoded tonal language into rhythm, allowing complex messages to travel distances speech couldn't reach. The drum was telegraph. The drum was also text. Ritual choreography, precise sequencing of gesture, movement, spatial positioning, functioned as embodied script. Vodun ceremonies, Igbo masquerades, Zulu coming-of-age rituals, all followed patterns encoding cosmology, law, history into repeatable, correctable, transmissible form. The dance was the document. This is inscription at civilizational scale. Writing wasn't confined to one medium because no single medium could survive all conditions. If paper burned, skin remained. If monuments fell, cloth carried the pattern. If speech was banned, drums spoke. If drums were seized, bodies danced. The system was distributed by design. The colonial attack was systematic. African scripts weren't forgotten accidentally. They were systematically suppressed. Missionaries banned indigenous scripts and imposed European alphabets as prerequisite for literacy and salvation. Christian missions outlawed teaching indigenous scripts in their schools, which became the only schools available after colonial governments destroyed traditional education systems. Colonial administrators dismissed African scripts as superstition, decoration, proto-writing, anything but real literacy. French colonial policy explicitly prohibited indigenous languages in schools. Belgian authorities restricted literacy education. Portuguese criminalized indigenous language instruction. The effect was deliberate. Sever populations from their own textual traditions and make them dependent on European-mediated literacy. Entire cultures were reclassified as oral, even when textual traditions existed. Literacy became a weapon of domination. Why script matters now. Understanding. African writing systems changes everything. How history is recorded, How knowledge authority is assigned. How memory survives rupture. How Africa's contributions are evaluated. Script explains why African memory persisted even when archives burned, because writing was never confined to paper. When manuscripts were destroyed, skin still bore scars. When libraries were looted, cloth still carried patterns. When formal education was banned, bodies still danced the choreography. When all else failed, song still encoded the message. This is why script operates within the bridgeworks alongside fable, griot, score, sigil, spell, together forming Africa's knowledge survivability infrastructure. Each reinforces the others. Each compensates when another fails. Script was never the only system. It was one node in a distributed network designed to ensure knowledge could regenerate even after catastrophic loss. This is why African knowledge survived transatlantic enslavement, colonial suppression, systematic erasure. Not perfectly, not completely, but functionally, because the architecture was designed for rupture from the beginning. The core truth. Africa was never illiterate. Africa was encoded. The scripts exist. The archives exist. The universities existed. The continuity is documented. Africa didn't lose its writing because it lacked institutions. It lost recognition because those institutions were dismantled, burned, or reclassified by empire. The world didn't invent writing alone. It inherited it and refused to acknowledge Africa, making them recipients, not originators, developers and participants in the creation of knowledge and the principles of learning.
This work is part of the Bridgeworks, an original civilizational framework developed by Chinenye Egbuna Ikwemesi within Aphrodites, a restorative and corrective project making pre-colonial African history legible while teaching the same encoded knowledge, cultures, and practices across the diaspora. The goal is to demonstrate the power and sophistication of African civilizational architecture, how knowledge was archived, transmitted, and preserved across time and rupture. Aphrodites exists to prove that African memory systems were not primitive, they were engineered for survival, and they worked.